Arianne Brunet, Montreal, Québec, Canada.
Do you live in a secular country?
I wouldn't say so, no. Historically speaking, if I look at Quebec, Quebec was very much under the thumb of the Catholic Church until what we called the Quiet Revolution. We're talking about the 1960s, by which then the major changes were to try to get public schoolings, hospitals back into the hands of the states, and so we thought we had gained something. In effect, there were the schooling problem, by which there were either Catholic schools or Protestant schools.
You mean no state schools?
State schools were either Catholic schools or Protestant schools, which historically, when we look at what's happening today, we have to acknowledge that henceforth we did not have a secular state. But because of the huge changes already, where the churches did not decide on the curriculums of the schools anymore, or had the managerial power in our hospitals anymore, we believed we had reached certainly a better environment for secular society than we had. No doubt about that. But we didn't tend to the garden. And today, we're facing what we call the also famous accommodement raisonnable, which in English would be, là j'ai un blanc, it'll come back to me. The point is, the concept of this is when you look at demands of a cultural community, by which, for example, in Canada, the Sikh wanted to wear their turban as members of the police force. The courts got involved and granted them that possibility in a culture that sees itself, in a country that sees itself multicultural, from a definition that stems from the 60s and the 70s, by which the immigration of Canada then is not what it is today, and it's not with the same political purposes also. The use of multiculturalism has changed in our society. But this is not yet taken seriously into account in the legislative thinking mode of our parliaments, whether provincial or federal. That makes a huge difference. 3-4 years ago, we started with the battle against the Sharia law in the arbitration courts of Ontario.
On family matters.
On family matters. And this was interesting because unfortunately, people, if the Canadian Council of Muslim Women hadn't woke up the women's movement, I don't think we would have seen the problem. So we've learned something, and I'm certainly grateful that the Canadian Muslim Association has woken up to this situation, which means to us that the women's movement at least was starting to take into consideration the presence of Muslims around them, insofar as they try to get Canadian women to get involved in this particular issue, particularly in Ontario, and that us, outside of Ontario, we're also inviting the international women's movement to come into this discussion, because they would then have, from the countries of origins of many of those women that could come and tell them what you're doing will affect us. It has a bearing on us.
Can you remind us of the question? What was discussed? What was proposed?
What was discussed at the time was the idea of bringing family matters into arbitration courts that had been created at the outset. Certainly not for this. Arbitration courts were created to deal with business matters because of the clogging the too much backup with court cases.
So what would have been the effects on women?
The effect on women would have been a law that doesn't apply to all anymore. That's fundamental. B, the fact that some women would have been subjected to a different even thinking of what Muslim laws and family laws might be. We have no idea what type of family law that would have been enacted in those arbitration court. And one is led to believe, in view of who was proposing this, which were fundamentalists, that we would have in fact secured for conservative thinking a legal place for them to move their ideas.
What was the attitude of the left?
Silence. Silence. Relative culturalism thinking, in many articles we saw appearing in the press. Defense of multiculturalism, which is the tenet of the social fabric of Canada in the view of federal government thinking. Incapacity of rethinking what multiculturalism means in this day and age with the realities, and of course a total lack of acknowledgement that not only 2001, it's interesting that 2001 had happened in the States, henceforth a stronghold on security, but no analysis of the intellectual influence of conservatives, fundamentalists, whether they be Muslim, whether they be Jewish, whether they be Catholic and Christian, Jehovah's Witness, and so on. It's interesting that in the presentation that were made when a commission of inquiry was set up for the Ontario government to make a decision on whether or not they should be accepting family law in arbitration courts, the commissioner clearly stated that the Canadian Council of Muslim Women was not representative. Now that's another problem. Who represents who for whom is another important question that was going on in Canada at the time.
You have this tendency to dialogue with religious leaders, regardless of the fact that they are self-appointed, and that's a highly undemocratic process.
Not only that, but there is a way that Canadian politicians and human rights organizations, not all, but some, are washing their hands of this problem by going back to ecumenical dialogue, as they call it, by which, again, it's a discussion of religious sorts and not acknowledging the political impact of those religious thinkers who are trying to gain power in the political sphere. That in Canada is totally, totally evacuated. That is not seen to this day. In Quebec right now, there has been in the past year, year and a half, racist uprising, awakening of again, new ways of looking at the other from a racist perspective, but that is muddled also by what they're doing in terms of narrowing the space for critique and for free thinking, which I think is a fundamental of a secular society. So how is that happening? Example, a small village in the country, in Quebec, in the eastern townships, I believe it was, I could be wrong, decides that they will enact a law, a municipal law, for not accepting veiled women in their town. coming out of nowhere. No analysis because no way for them to have a conversation with intellectuals who are nowhere to be seen truly in this debate, except ronronnant, except in a sloppy sort of way, is the way I would say it. Again, cultural relativism, what we call in Quebec accommodement raisonnable, which by that we mean the courts, because the accommodement raisonnable is a legal term that's set up by the courts, by which they see that then a few individuals might lose their capacity to fully enjoy what the majority has, if there is not a reasonable accommodement, organized, compromise organized for those individuals. Now it has become something that everybody confused with, and I'll give you another example, the YWCA, allowing the Jewish community complaining because there is a rabbinic school behind the YWCA. They're parlaying this situation with the management of the Y. And at the end of this negotiation, dark windows are put so that the young boys on the other side do not see women doing their gym in the Y. Women are complaining, a petition comes out, they're saying, listen, we want to have the lights where we're doing our exercise. And that is called accommodement raisonnable. People are saying, hey, you know, we've negotiated and parleyed and so on, but to the detriment of whose enjoyment and right to have a light and to do their exercise in a light. So that's what's happening. So no, let's not talk about secular states in Quebec or Canada right now. We're not at that stage, unfortunately.
If I remember correctly, there's a mention of God in one of the fundamental texts.
In the Canadian Constitution.
What is it exactly?
You know, I don't know. What it says, I think, basically is that the country is, we're basically lauding God as we are entering in this, reading the charter. So it's not that we believe in God, but that we are talking to God as we are entering into this Constitution. So we're appreciating the divine as we are looking at the enactment of the Canadian Constitution. I think it's more something of that effect, nonetheless.
Yeah, this is definitely not secular.
Absolutely.
And how do you foresee the damages introduced by this UN resolution, the resolution of the Assembly, the UN Assembly, which states that all states should now introduce in their constitutions, in their laws, and in their teaching programs, respect for God, I think, not us, God, and the prophets.
I think it's one of the most horrendous things that has happened in the UN recently. And the fact that nobody is really waking up to this is worrisome. There's a confusion between a fundamental rights, religious tolerance, which means, let's be very precise here, which means as a minority in a society that has a different faith, I should be able to enjoy my faith freely. That were the fundamentals here. And then things grew over the years, where we have lost the sense of, in the privacy of who I am, if I want to go to a synagogue living in a Muslim environment, I should be able to do that. End of story. we have let sit into this process, which is an absolutely needed process of everybody understanding where my freedom starts, to a situation where now we are faced with secular countries' guilt for countries that are now destroying the capacity of secularism for their society, for their people. And it's this bartering that's going on because, again, this is another bartering chips for other gains by other states. And given into the United Nations the battle between the North and the South, between civil and political rights, social, economical, and cultural rights, this is in line with more bargaining chips. So it's very dangerous because we don't see what it means in terms of the influence that this has on the societies and the conservative forces that are now entering into a UN process. Not that it wasn't there before, given the fact that the Vatican has been having an observer status since the inception of the UN practically. So one has a tendency to worry, and that many of the religious were extremely jealous of that situation.
But precisely, it seems to me that the organization of the countries of the Islamic Conference also have a status in the UN now.
What it has now, it's not so much a status and in some ways it's more dangerous. It's that the states that are meeting in the UN, by tradition, meet by groupings. In the past, in the days of communism, they would meet around those lines, around those who were neutrals, the non-aligned group, around regional grouping, African group, Latin American group, North American, Europe, and the Australia-Japan group. Today, the Organization of Islamic Conference is also a grouping. What's interesting about that is that people who are out in other groupings are also in that grouping. So it changes the capacity of understanding when you negotiate language in a resolution, what will really happen at the end of the exercise, because one country that might have said A may end up saying B once it goes into its second grouping, that could be in this instance the Organization of Islamic Conferences. So it muddles our capacity of having also a negotiation power from a civil society perspective. Because lobbying the Organization of Islamic Conference is very unlikely from a civil society perspective.
Do you think there will be a mobilization against this UN resolution in Quebec?
Not at this point. And I'll tell you why. Because right now the Quebecers are seeing the present problem of those famous économes. There's been, again, called by the provincial government an inquiry to study better this situation and to try to find ways of better understanding for Quebecers their identity. So it's mixed with an identity issue, which is also another problem about this inquiry. And the volition on many is to try to make peace with those communities instead of trying to clarify for Quebecers what accommodement raisonnable means, to restrain and specify and clarify that understanding, and to make sure that we are in a secular state. So I'm not so sure that this commission of inquiry will amount to. But if there is a movement towards that, then there will be a movement towards this resolution for the Assembly. So it's a step-by-step situation here. Let's look at the local problem, and at this juncture, there's not enough women and there's not enough leftists that are looking at the present inquiry with an attitude of we want a secular state, and we therefore need to find along those lines. Once that has happened, then yes, I believe that it will come logically to fight against this resolution, yes.
So what are the risks for the women in Quebec of this development of including religious thinking and religions, organized religions?
For us, it's going backwards. And so the problem again could also be, I mean, it's complex, all those issues are complex, a generational one. My generations have seen the Catholic fundamentalism in our country. But my niece has no clue what that meant. So therefore, could be distance from our sense of vigilance, our need for awareness, the importance of being vigilant and acting. They're more on the fence at this point, looking from an altermondialist globalization perspective.
Which includes fundamentalists.
And seeing this brassage of culture as something that's needed and necessary, without acknowledging that this doesn't happen without, we are in a vacuum political in the left. In fact, we are in a vacuum. It's good intentions, but no political thinking. And that is the danger right now that the left is going through. So
feminists.
And feminists are going through. So yes, the danger for women is huge. Is huge. Because if women cannot do their gym in a Y with lights, because they're perturbing the young boys in the rabbinic school, we have a major problem on our hands down the road.
In fact, what they actually did is veil the women.
Exactly. Exactly. And not only through the veil, but through it's the invisibilization of women. That's where we're back.
It's for the women to hide from the men, not the reverse.
Exactly. Exactly.
So that's the exact meaning of purda, veil,
Absolutely.
all these
Absolutely.
institutions.
Except that is not made. That link is not made. And that's why we're in dire strait. Because in as long as women don't see the importance of acknowledging that kind of situation, now, not when it's now that we need to acknowledge it. So I am grateful for those women in that gym who passed on a petition and said, no, you're not going to do this to us. The problem with this is that they did it, but the women's movements, the groups, did not say, hey, we're backing them 100%.
So why don't you make it international? It's a small issue.
That's right.
Small case, not
That's
a small
right.
issue. It's a big issue in a small case.
Well, I see that small group did win. They did win. And the window were changed again.
Mm-hmm.
But what I'm worrying is that in as long as, oh, well, they solved their issue, that's okay. Somebody else is going to try something else until the whole society says no. And particularly in this instance, the whole women's movement says, this is our stand, this is where we're coming from. So we're not waiting to react, we're acting. That's what needs to happen.
Okay. Is there something that you want to add that we have not touched upon?
Well, I truly believe that if we don't address the issue of fundamentalisms, that we don't make the linkages into our daily lives, and not it's something that's happening outside of me, but in our daily lives, how it affects us. Again, I'm going back to this example of the gym. This is your daily life. Anybody has the right to go and do exercise and feel that they can do it in the proper environment for exercising. If we don't see that this is happening and will happen for me down the road, I'm a musician, let's say, what can happen? I'm a nurse, what can happen to me? If we don't make those linkages, we are in dire strait. It is not the time right now to sit and congratulate ourselves. There's nothing we can congratulate ourselves about right now because we have not been vigilant enough.